Marxism is a method of socio-economic analysis, originating from the mid to late 19th century works of German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that analyzes class relations and societal conflicts using a materialist interpretation of historical development and a dialectical view of social transformation. Marxist methodology originally used economic and socio-political inquiry to analyze and critique the development of capitalism and the role of class struggle in systemic economic change. According to Marxist analysis, class conflict within capitalism arises due to intensifying contradictions between highly productive mechanized and socialized production performed by the proletariat, and private ownership and appropriation of the surplus product in the form of surplus value by a small minority of private owners called the bourgeoisie. As the contradiction becomes apparent to the proletariat, social unrest between the two antagonistic classes intensifies, culminating in a social revolution. The eventual long-term outcome of this revolution would be the establishment of socialism, a socio-economic system based on social ownership of the means of production, distribution based on one's contribution, and production organized directly for use. As the productive forces and technology continued to advance, Marx hypothesized that socialism would eventually give way to a communist stage of social development, which would be a classless, stateless, humane society erected on common ownership and the principle of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Marxism has since developed into different branches and schools of thought, and there is now no single definitive Marxist theory. Different schools place a greater emphasis on certain aspects of classical Marxism while de-emphasizing or rejecting other aspects, and sometimes combine Marxist analysis with non-Marxian concepts. As a result, different schools of Marxism might reach contradictory conclusions from one another. Marxist analyses and methodologies have influenced multiple political ideologies and social movements, and Marxist understandings of history and society have been adopted by academics in the disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, media studies, political science, theater, history, sociology, art history and theory, cultural studies, education, economics, geography, literary criticism, aesthetics, critical psychology, and philosophy. Overview. The Marxian analysis begins with an analysis of material conditions in the economic activities required to satisfy society's material needs. It is understood that the form of economic organization, or mode of production, gives rise to, or at least directly influences, most other social phenomena, including social relations, political and legal systems, morality and ideology. The economic system and these social relations form a base and superstructure. As forces of production, most notably technology, improve, existing forms of social organization become inefficient and stifle further progress. As Karl Marx observed, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Under the capitalist mode of production, this struggle materializes between the minority who own the means of production, and the vast majority of the population who produce goods and services. Taking the idea that social change occurs because of the struggle between different classes within society who are under contradiction against each other, leads the Marxist analysis to the conclusion that capitalism exploits and oppresses the proletariat, which leads to a proletarian revolution. Capitalism can no longer sustain the living standards of the population due to its need to compensate for falling rates of profit by driving down wages, cutting social benefits and pursuing military aggression. The socialist system would succeed capitalism as humanity's mode of production through workers' revolution. According to Marxism, especially arising from crisis theory, socialism is a historical necessity. In a socialist society, private property and the means of production would be superseded by cooperative ownership. A socialist economy would not base production on the creation of private profits, but on the criteria of satisfying human needs, that is, production would be carried out directly for use. As Engels observed, then the capitalist mode of appropriation in which the product enslaves first the producer, and then appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the product that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production, upon the one hand, direct social appropriation, as means to the maintenance and extension of production; on the other, direct individual appropriation, as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. Concepts. Historical materialism, the discovery of the materialist conception of history, or rather, the consistent continuation and extension of materialism into the domain of social phenomenon, removed two chief defects of earlier historical theories. In the first place, they at best examined only the ideological motives of the historical activity of human beings, without grasping the objective laws governing the development of the system of social relations. In the second place, the earlier theories did not cover the activities of the masses of the population, whereas historical materialism made it possible for the first time to study with the accuracy of the natural sciences the social conditions of the life of the masses and the changes in these conditions. Russian Marxist theoretician and revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, 1913. Society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. Karl Marx. Grundrisse. 1858. The historical materialist theory of history dialectically analyzes the underlying causes of societal development and change in the collective ways humans make their living. All constituent features of a society stem from economic activity, an idea often conveyed with the metaphor of the base and superstructure. The base and superstructure metaphor explains that the totality of social relations in and by which humans product and reproduct their social existence forms a society's economic base. From this base rises a superstructure of political and legal institutions, i.e., ruling class. The base corresponds to the social consciousness, and it conditions the superstructure and the dominant ideology. A conflict between the development of material productive forces and the relations of production provokes social revolutions. Thus, the resultant changes to the economic base will lead to the transformation of the superstructure. This relationship is reflexive. At first, the base gives rise to the superstructure and remains the foundation of a form of social organization. Hence, that formed social organization can act again upon both parts of the base and superstructure, whose relationship is not unilinear but dialectic, namely a relationship driven by conflicts and contradictions. As Friedrich Engels clarified, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended, either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Marx considered these socio-economic conflicts as the driving force of human history, since these recurring conflicts have manifested themselves as distinct transitional stages of development in Western Europe. Accordingly, Marx designates human history as encompassing four stages of development in relations of production. Primitive communism, as in cooperative tribal societies. Slave society, a development of tribal to city-state. Aristocracy is born. Feudalism, aristocrats are the ruling class. Merchants evolve into capitalists. Capitalism. Capitalists are the ruling class, who create and employ the proletariat. Criticism of capitalism. We are, in Marx's terms, an ensemble of social relations, and we live our lives at the core of the intersection of a number of unequal social relations based on hierarchically interrelated structures which, together, define the historical specificity of the capitalist modes of production and reproduction and underlay their observable manifestations. Martha E. Jimenez, Marxism in Class, Gender and Race. Rethinking the Trilogy according to the Marxist theoretician and revolutionary Vladimir Lenin. The principal content of Marxism was Marx's economic doctrine. Marx believed that the capitalist bourgeois and their economists were promoting what he saw as the lie that the interests of the capitalist and those of the worker are one and the same. He believed that they did this by purporting the concept that the fastest possible growth of productive capital was best not only for the wealthy capitalists but also for the workers because it provided them with employment. Exploitation is a matter of surplus labor, the amount of labor one performs beyond what one receives in goods. Exploitation has been a socio-economic feature of every class society, and is one of the principal features distinguishing the social classes. The power of one social class to control the means of production enables its exploitation of the other classes. In capitalism, the labor theory of value is the operative concern. The value of a commodity equals the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Under that condition, surplus value is synonymous with the term surplus labor. Thus, capitalist exploitation is realized as deriving surplus value from the worker. In pre-capitalist economies, exploitation of the worker was achieved via physical coercion. In the capitalist mode of production, that result is more subtly achieved because the worker does not own the means of production. He or she must voluntarily enter into an exploitive work relationship with a capitalist in order to earn the necessities of life. The worker's entry into such employment is voluntary in that he or she chooses which capitalist to work for. However, the worker must work or starve. Thus, exploitation is inevitable, and the voluntary nature of a worker participating in a capitalist society is illusory. Alienation is the estrangement of people from their humanity, which is a systematic result of capitalism. Under capitalism, the fruits of production belong to the employers, who expropriate the surplus created by others, and so generate alienated laborers. In Marx's view, alienation is an objective characterization of the worker's situation in capitalism. His or her self-awareness of this condition is not prerequisite. Social classes. The identity of a social class derives from its relationship to the means of production. Marx describes the social classes in capitalist societies. Proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. As Andrei Platonov expressed, the working class is my home country and my future is linked with the proletariat. The capitalist mode of production establishes the conditions enabling the bourgeoisie to exploit the proletariat because the workers' labor generates a surplus value greater than the workers' wages. Bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, and buy labor power from the proletariat, thus exploiting the proletariat. They subdivide as bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie. Petty bourgeoisie are those who work and can afford to buy little labor power, i.e., small business owners, peasant landlords, trade workers. Al. Marxism predicts that the continual reinvention of the means of production eventually would destroy the petty bourgeoisie, degrading them from the middle class to the proletariat. Lumpen proletariat, the outcasts of society such as criminals, vagabonds, beggars, prostitutes, al., who have no stake in the economy and no mind of their own and so are decoyed by every bidder. Landlords, a historically important social class who retain some wealth and power. Peasantry and farmers, a scattered class incapable of organizing and affecting socio-economic change, most of whom would enter the proletariat, and some become landlords. Class consciousness denotes the awareness of itself and the social world that a social class possesses, and its capacity to rationally act in their best interests. Hence, class consciousness is required before they can effect a successful revolution. Without defining ideology, Marx used the term to denote the production of images of social reality. According to Engels, ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker consciously, it is true, but with a false consciousness. The real motive forces impelling him remain unknown to him, otherwise it simply would not be an ideological process. Hence he imagines false or seeming motive forces. Because the ruling class controls the society's means of production, the superstructure of society, the ruling social ideas are determined by the best interests of the said ruling class. In the German ideology, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e., the class which is the ruling material force of society, is, at the same time, its ruling intellectual force. The term political economy originally denoted the study of the conditions under which economic production was organized in the capitalist system. In Marxism, political economy studies the means of production, specifically of capital, and how that manifests as economic activity. Marxism taught me what society was. I was like a blindfolded man in a forest, who doesn't even know where north or south is. If you don't eventually come to truly understand the history of the class struggle, or at least have a clear idea that society is divided between the rich and the poor, and that some people subjugate and exploit other people, you're lost in a forest, not knowing anything. Cuban revolutionary and Marxist-Leninist politician Fidel Castro on Discovering Marxism, 2009. Revolution, Socialism, and Communism. Marxists believe that the transition from capitalism to socialism is an inevitable part of the development of human society. As Lenin stated, it is evident that Marx deduces the inevitability of the transformation of capitalist society into a socialist society wholly and exclusively from the economic law of motion of contemporary society. Marxists believe that a socialist society will be far better for the majority of the populace than its capitalist counterpart. For instance, prior to the Russian Revolution of 1917, Lenin wrote that the socialization of production is bound to lead to the conversion of the means of production into the property of society. This conversion will directly result in an immense increase in productivity of labor, a reduction of working hours, and the replacement of the remnants, the ruins of small-scale, primitive, disunited production by collective and improved labor. The failure of 1905 revolution and the socialist movement's failure to resist the outbreak of the First World War led to renewed theoretical effort and valuable contributions from Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg towards an appreciation of Marx's crisis theory and efforts to formulate a theory of imperialism. Classical Marxism. The term classical Marxism denotes the collection of socio-eco-political theories expounded by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marxism, as Ernest Mandel remarked, is always open, always critical, always self-critical. As such, classical Marxism distinguishes between Marxism, as broadly perceived, and what Marx believed. Thus, in 1883, Marx wrote to the French labor leader Jules Guesde and to Paul Lafargue, both of whom claimed to represent Marxist principles, accusing him of revolutionary phrase-mongering, and of denying the value of reformist struggle. From Marx's letter derives the paraphrase, "If that is Marxism, then I am not a Marxist." American Marxist scholar Hal Draper responded to this comment by saying, "There are few thinkers in modern history whose thought has been so badly misrepresented by Marxists and anti-Marxists alike." Criticism. Some Marxists have criticized the academic institutionalization of Marxism for being too shallow and detached from political action. For instance, Zimbabwean Trotskyist Alex Kalinikos, himself a professional academic, stated that its practitioners remind one of Narcissus, who in the Greek legend fell in love with his own reflection. Sometimes it is necessary to devote time to clarifying and developing the concepts that we use, but indeed for Western Marxists this has become an end in itself. The result is a body of writings incomprehensible to all but a tiny minority of highly qualified scholars. Academic Marxism. Marxism has been adopted by a large number of academics and other scholars working in various disciplines. The theoretical development of Marxist archaeology was first developed in the Soviet Union in 1929, when a young archaeologist named Vladislav I. Ravdonikas published a report entitled For a Soviet History of Material Culture. Within this work, the very discipline of archaeology as it then stood was criticized as being inherently bourgeoisie and therefore anti-socialist. And so, as a part of the academic reforms instituted in the Soviet Union under the administration of Premier Joseph Stalin, a great emphasis was placed on the adoption of Marxist archaeology throughout the country. These theoretical developments were subsequently adopted by archaeologists working in capitalist states outside of the Leninist bloc, most notably by the Australian academic V. Gordon Childe, who used Marxist theory in his understandings of the development of human society. Etymology. The term Marxism was popularized by Karl Kautsky, who considered himself an orthodox Marxist during the dispute between the orthodox and revisionist followers of Marx. Kautsky's revisionist rival Edward Bernstein also later adopted use of the term. Engels did not support the use of the term Marxism to describe either Marx's or his views. Engels claimed that the term was being abusively used as a rhetorical qualifier by those attempting to cast themselves as real followers of Marx, while casting others in different terms, such as Lassalleans. In 1882, Engels claimed that Marx had criticized self-proclaimed Marxist Paul Lafargue by saying that if Lafargue's views were considered Marxist, then, oh, nothing is certain, and that is that I am not a Marxist.